two, one, two, three.
Hello, and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. My name is David Foote. I'm an activist with the local chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. I'm joined today by Theresa Alt, also a member, long time, of Ithaca DSA. And we're here today to talk a little bit about the budget, which is currently waiting to be passed, which gives us a little bit of an opportunity to reflect on what could be in the New York State budget, what should be, how we envision a better future taking place through government support for really community-based projects and things that would benefit regular people. Unfortunately, we aren't joined today by the guest who we had hoped for, our assembly person, Dr. Anna Kellis, who was going to be our guest because the budget vote is still being delayed. Theresa, can you tell us a little bit more?
I think you kind of said the main reason for Anna not being here. She's in Albany and waiting for the budget vote and doesn't have anything to tell us about it yet because it hasn't happened yet. So we don't really have any information. The budget is at that stage that always used to be called three men in a room: the governor, the speaker of the assembly, and basically the head person in the state senate. It is no longer three men. It is now one man and two women. But that doesn't really seem to have changed the dynamics. So I think we're just going to talk about what we would like to see come out of it. And I know for me, one of the biggest things is to tax the rich. And there have been proposals before both houses to do that. The state can decide what taxes it sets, unlike cities and counties and villages and towns. And the state does have an income tax, and it is a graduated income tax. That is, people with higher incomes pay at a higher rate, but the rate could be graduated much more sharply so that the really high paid people, the people with incomes of over a couple of 100,000, let's say.
To draw a line. To draw a line randomly.
Yeah.
More than we'll ever see.
Yeah. Or more than we'll ever need, for sure, even if we see it. And I think having lived for years on lower incomes, we will know if we get a higher one that we don't need it. So that's one thing, but then there are a whole bunch of other proposals in the tax the rich suggestions.
Yes, once we started increasing the state budget this way, there's a lot we could do with that.
Well, for instance, taxing corporations more thoroughly, where they do their business rather than in some fictitious place where they just have a post office box. Taxes on financial transactions, on stock sales. Some of this is already in the law and then is automatically rebated. And I think there were a couple of other suggestions that I'm forgetting now, to be honest. So then comes the question of, if we do this, what do we spend the money on? Well, there are lots of things. I mean, one that it has not come up as a state, well, it has not come up locally very much as a state question. In other places it has. Public transit. Public transit, in principle, is partially financed by the state. Well, it could, if the state had more money, public transit could be much better financed by the state.
Yes, this is something that has been a campaign here in Ithaca as we act to make our local buses free for everyone?
Fare free or free fares,
Yes.
but also very important. Two other very important things would be extended hours, more routes, and more frequent buses, and more reliable service, which probably just means that you have to have some redundancy in the system. Drivers ready to step in if something goes wrong with a driver. Equipment ready to be used if something goes wrong with a piece of equipment. And with its bare bones budgeting, this is not, this is what the sort of thing that that TCAP doesn't have at this
Yes.
point.
We all know what the needs are related to transportation. It's always a question of just not having the means to make it happen.
Right. But the means could be there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I know that our local campaign is talking about getting Cornell, which has loads of money to pay. I had my own little personal suggestion that we kind of stop beating our heads against a brick wall at Cornell and turn to the state and ask the state for money. And if we get money from the state, then the state can see how tax-exempt Cornell is ripping them off, and they could actually do something about it.
Interesting. Well, if we don't spend it on transit, if we can't get, if we take our eye off of, or if we get Cornell to pay for TCAP, again, we're sort of visioning and seeing what a better world would look like if we can get the reforms we've been asking for. What else would the New York State budget then be able to pay for?
Right. Well, one thing that it would be able to pay for and yet might not have to is health care. Because I think there have been a lot of studies that show that if we had a statewide single payer system, that is a single state-run health insurance system, rather than the collection of Medicaid and Medicare and VA and a whole long list of private insurances, if we had this single system, we could save enough money that we would actually be spending less, and that would include the state spending less, for instance. But it hasn't happened yet. So I wouldn't exactly call that a tax item. I think maybe if a system were introduced all at once, there would be a surge in initial costs as people rush to make up for years of postponing their health care.
Mm-hmm.
But that would end, and with more preventive services, presumably, people would be healthier. Certainly, there would be less use of the emergency room, which is one of the most expensive ways to give health care.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
So many people end up there
But
for things that a primary care physician could have handled.
Yeah. But that's, as I said, that's not really a question of a lot more taxes ongoing. There has been talk about the need for public internet, because there are so many places that private companies just don't bother to serve.
And since we've seen, since 2020, when even things like education of elementary school students was a question of internet access during the lockdowns.
Yeah. Now I know the town of Dryden has made and is has initiated a move toward town internet. And I'm actually not quite sure how they intend to pay for it, but I doubt that it's going to be based entirely on the property tax. There has been talk about the need to have other utilities be public.
Public power,
Yeah, public power.
not just people power.
Public power so that it can be turned green and fossil free in a reasonable way without interference from a lot of profit grabbing.
Correct, yes, by multinational corporations.
And there has been talk about raising the minimum wage. Now, that in a way sounds like not like something that taxes would have to pay for, because it's all employers who pay wages. But there are certain kinds of jobs that get state funding. For instance, a lot of home health care aides, that kind of thing. And again, with a better tax base, the state would be able to reimburse payments to these very essential workers at a rate that the workers could afford to live at, so that they don't have to quit their healthcare jobs and go and flip hamburgers.
Yeah, so that would be part of the budget vote then, not legislated separately as a minimum wage increase.
I'm not actually sure, once again,
Interesting.
but I think there would have to be a budget provision to make it possible, because some jobs would have to be reimbursed at higher rates.
Yes.
Now, actually, those jobs could have wages raised without everybody else, but it probably doesn't serve the broad public very well that way. And there is one huge area, and that is housing.
Something that affects every one of us.
Yeah, for sure. And it seems to me that with a better supply, no, maybe I'll back up and say, and I've heard people say, well, the city should just pay out less to the police and build public housing. But that would be based on property taxes. And so it would actually raise the cost of housing for everybody else except those few who got the public units. But if it's based on an income tax, based on a tax based on ability to pay one way or another, then indeed huge amounts of money can be raised. I think some of the advocates were talking about 50 billion in a year. Huge amounts could be raised, and reasonable amounts of housing could be built. Now, there's some questions about public, lots of people say, oh, public housing, that's something awful. Well, it doesn't have to be. A lot of people have now visited the city of Vienna in Austria that has a 100-year history of building high quality public housing, and is at the point where something like half of the Viennese live in public housing.
Wow.
not because half the Viennese are impoverished, but because public housing is is a perfectly acceptable middle class way to live.
And like, as you mentioned with utilities, it removes a profit-seeking measure from something that everyone needs.
Right. That's part of it. Now, one interesting question is why, for instance, public housing succeeded in Austria, particularly in the city of Vienna, but not in, let's say, not so well in Britain and not so well in the United States. And there's a lot that one can go into. For one thing, Austria just has stiffer building codes than the United States. And that I learned that in my family because one of the refugees in the family refugees from Hitler was an architect. And when he got to New York, he was just shocked at the quality of the housing, the low standards to which it was built. And so this housing that was built there 100 years ago is still standing and still happily occupied.
Pretty impressive.
Now, one of those visitors to Vienna suggested that one thing that had made it possible was that when the Austrian Empire, the monarchy, went down, there was public land was available to build on. And that is sometimes an issue, let's say in Ithaca. You want to build affordable housing, where would you put it?
Yes, I've heard that a lot.
The land prices are so high. And I think that is a discussion for another day, because it doesn't really relate to the state budget.
We'll have an urban planning in Ithaca show.
Well, I think it has some things to do with the machinations of our Industrial Development Agency. But again, as I say, that is a bit of another topic. And the state could regulate industrial development agencies more thoroughly. But I doubt that would be part of the budget. So, yeah, what works in public housing? Quality, building good quality. There's the example, apparently, of British council housing, which was built after a different world war, after World War II. The land was there because existing buildings had been simply bombed, but the materials to build with weren't really available, and all sorts of shortcuts were taken in the rush to house people. And then money that had been set aside for maintenance was gobbled up, fixing all the problems that were caused by inferior materials. And pretty soon there was no more maintenance, and the buildings became rather flawed, whereupon anybody who could afford to get out got out. And what was left was really only poor people, and it kind of went downhill from there. And then Margaret Thatcher came along and, of course, said that privatization was the way out, which probably was not a good idea, but that's what happened. There are also discussions around public housing within the United States. Some of it was, for whatever reason, built as very high buildings. And that turned out to be not such a good idea. Not 100% clear to me why. Well, for one thing, you very much rely on elevators, and if the elevator is out, then it's a real problem. But I think there's some more to it than that. Some of those buildings, I think, were just too big, and people didn't really form communities within them. And I think studies have shown that where there was public housing that was more like townhouses, row houses, that had a much better history and has actually been successful has been successful in some places.
Yeah, I can see that. I can't really, while building a tall building in Ithaca ensures some fantastic views, I can't see lugging your furniture up more than, say, 3 stories. But if you build a row houses, you're moving in on the first floor and just carrying it up the stairs when you need to.
Okay. Now, what could New York do other than simply build housing that is publicly owned? Well, New York has on the books a program. It's called Mitchell-Lama. It's been around for 50 or so years. And it, as far as I can see, builds, subsidizes private housing with provisions to keep it affordable at least for 20 years and possibly to renew the affordability after that. And these Mitchell-Lama buildings have been very successful in New York City, which seems to be where most of them or all of them are. They are essentially mixed income, with the people who have middle-class incomes paying middle-class rents, and the people who have low incomes paying low rents. And I actually have a friend who lives in a Mitchell-Lama building, one of my old friends from my New York City days. And I remember once visiting him at his building, and Wales looked down at a parcel there and realized that it was addressed to the sister of a friend of his who has a very distinctive name.
So that maybe does build some community if you can know who you're living around. You certainly start to form bonds with the local social family.
Well, and that also just takes staying longer in the same place. I mean, for a while, by the way, public housing, for a while I was appointed to the board of the Ithaca Housing Authority, and there was this real contradiction in policy, which was being set in those days by Andrew Cuomo, who was Secretary of Housing and Urban Development at that time, I guess under Clinton. Tenants were supposed to be encouraged to take part, to elect members to the board and take part in the meetings and stuff like that. On the other hand, they were also being encouraged to move out as fast as possible. Well, you aren't likely to be doing both at the same time. Now, another way that New York City historically has gotten some very good housing that working people could live in. It was absolutely meant for working people. Were buildings sponsored by, for instance, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union or the Electricians Union.
So a strong labor movement might give us better housing.
And, collect the money that could then be invested in housing for the membership. But for instance, when it comes to one of the biggest cooperatives anywhere, Co-op City in the Bronx, with something like 50,000 residents, which means it's as big as Ithaca, just this one set of buildings. The Amalgamated Clothing Workers apparently kind of started it, but funding came from Mitchell-Lama. So there's another way, putting together union money and state money.
Yeah, have to be kind of flexible. Well, Theresa, we've got about a minute left to talk about our dreams and our hopes and possibilities for a just New York State budget. Did you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, I think I will say that social housing is a term used for something that might be public housing, but might have other forms of ownership. And according to the DSA, National DSA's Housing Justice Commission, it should be accessible to all. People should have a choice of where and with whom they live. The buildings should be self-governing with regard to their rules. And interestingly, when I said, well, maybe a not-for-profit would own them, the response was, no, not not-for-profits. They behave just like private companies. And I'm still not 100% sure about that, but maybe I'll leave with that question.
Sure. I mean, it sounds like a fantastic set of principles to apply to just about any situation, not just housing. Well, thank you, Theresa, for sharing all of this information. Again, my name is David Foote, here for Ithaca DSA Presents, with my fellow Democratic Socialists of America member, Theresa Alt.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.